Picture this: a black woman minding her own business, out for a simple walk by the river. Suddenly, a police officer approaches and shoves her into the water without warning. But what happens next will shock you. She doesn't stay down. Instead, she fights back, and the officer freezes. What happens next flips the whole situation on its head. Before we dive in, let us know, where are you watching from? Jasmine was just like any other woman, trying to live her life despite the challenges she faced. At 28, she had grown accustomed to the stares, the judgment, and the discrimination. Yet, she refused to let any of it define her. She worked hard, stood tall, and found peace by the river after a long day at her job. The cool breeze and the sound of the flowing water were her escape from the chaos of the world. That day, however, was different. Jasmine was walking along the riverbank, her mind drifting away from the stress of life when she noticed a police officer walking toward her. Officer Davis, known for his aggressive tendencies and short temper, had been patrolling the area for some time. When he saw Jasmine, something about her presence set him off. His eyes narrowed, and his hand instinctively went to his belt. Without a word, he approached her. Jasmine could feel his eyes on her, and her guard went up. She had learned over the years to be careful around officers like him. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet she could already sense trouble. What happened next would set off a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. Jasmine's walk by the river should have been peaceful. But then she saw him. Officer Davis, striding towards her with a look she knew all too well. His eyes weren't friendly. He was already sizing her up, like he had some sort of authority over her. She'd been down this road before. She wasn't going to let him control this moment. "Hey!" he snapped, stepping into her path. "What are you doing here?" Jasmine stopped in her tracks. "Just walking," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But she could see the hostility in his eyes. "Where's your ID?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she knew this wouldn't be a normal encounter. She was already feeling trapped. "I don't need to show you anything," she replied, trying to stand her ground. Officer Davis didn't like that answer. His jaw tightened and his voice grew louder. "You think you can just be here without explaining yourself? I said show me your ID." Jasmine could feel the situation spiraling. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but the officer's aggression made it clear. He wasn't going to let this go. She stood her ground, refusing to show fear. But as she tried to walk past him, his hand shot out, pushing her hard into the river. The shock of the cold water hit her instantly. Her body went numb, but she didn't have time to feel sorry for herself. She struggled to stay above the water's surface, gasping for air as the shock wore off. She wasn't going to let this man get away with it. This wasn't just an assault. It was a fight for her dignity, for her rights. Officer Davis stood at the riverbank, staring down at her. He wasn't moving, his hand still near his gun. He expected her to stay down. He thought she'd be scared. But Jasmine wasn't done. She fought the current, pushing her way toward the edge. Each stroke was fueled by rage, the injustice of the situation burning through her. She finally grabbed hold of the bank, dragging herself up. Soaked and furious, she stood, looking at the officer who had just tried to drown her. Her eyes locked on his, and she saw the uncertainty flicker in his. He wasn't prepared for this. Jasmine shook the water from her face, her body cold, but her spirit unbroken. "You think you can just do whatever you want," she said, her voice steady but sharp. You think you can push me around?" Officer Davis took a step back. His hand hesitated near his belt, like he was considering whether to escalate further. He'd pushed her into the river thinking she'd be a victim, but she wasn't. Jasmine wasn't backing down. She was done being afraid. "You made a mistake," she said, still soaked but standing tall, her body trembling with anger and adrenaline. "You messed with the wrong one." For a moment, the officer just stared at her, frozen. He had no idea what to do now. He thought he could bully her, but Jasmine was the one in control now. The crowd around them had grown. Bystanders had started recording. Officer Davis was realizing too late that his actions had just been captured. His hesitation, his doubt, lingered in the air. He hadn't expected Jasmine to fight back, to stand so strong in the face of aggression. And now he didn't know how to deal with it. Jasmine stepped closer, not out of fear, but because she knew she had the power here. She had been pushed, but she was standing stronger than ever. The officer still hadn't moved. And Jasmine? She wasn't backing down. Jasmine stood at the edge of the river, soaked to the bone, but she wasn't backing down. The cold water that had soaked through her clothes didn't matter. Her focus was on the officer in front of her, who was still standing like nothing had happened. He was the one who had pushed her into the river, and now he was waiting for her to cower, to show weakness. But Jasmine wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with anger. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced discrimination her whole life. But this time, this moment, she was done being the victim. She had fought through worse, and Officer Davis wasn't going to be the one to break her. "You think you can just push me around?" Jasmine's voice was firm, unwavering, as she looked him dead in the eyes. Officer Davis blinked, caught off guard by the strength in her voice. He expected her to stay down, to accept what he had done. But Jasmine wasn't going anywhere. "You're wrong if you think I'll just let this go." His jaw tightened as he shifted on his feet, clearly trying to process the fact that Jasmine wasn't terrified. His hands twitched as if he was considering whether to pull out his weapon or just retreat. But Jasmine wasn't giving him that option. She stood her ground, staring him down with a fire that he had never seen before. "Get back," Officer Davis barked. His voice had lost the confidence it had once held. Jasmine could see it, the uncertainty in his eyes, the realization that he wasn't in control anymore. He wasn't the one holding all the power. She was. Jasmine took a step forward, her determination growing with every second. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her words sharp, cutting through the tense air. "You don't get to push me around because you think you can. Not today, not anymore." Officer Davis, realizing how much this situation had spiraled out of his control, hesitated. He could see the crowd gathering in the background, people watching, recording every moment on their phones. The weight of the situation hit him hard. This wasn't just some random altercation. This was on display for everyone to see. His actions were under a microscope now. He looked down at the riverbank, then back at Jasmine, his mind racing. He had crossed a line, and the moment he pushed her into the water, he had lost control. Jasmine wasn't just a random woman he could push around. She wasn't just someone to be dismissed. She was standing up for herself, and he knew he couldn't backtrack now. For a moment, Officer Davis was paralyzed by doubt. His body remained tense, but his mind wasn't sure. He had thought she'd collapse in fear, but Jasmine wasn't backing down. The fearlessness in her eyes made him question everything he had ever believed about power. And then it happened. Jasmine moved closer, her voice even more powerful as she stood face to face with the officer. "You think you've won? Think again. You've messed with the wrong person today." Her words were a challenge, daring him to do something, anything. The officer, who had once been so sure of himself, finally faltered. Jasmine's strength had completely disarmed him. She wasn't just another person to bully, another victim to silence. She was fighting for herself, for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And in that moment, Officer Davis realized the truth. He had no power over her. She was a force, unyielding and strong, and his power had shattered in front of her. He had underestimated the resilience of the woman he'd tried to harm. Jasmine, soaked and bruised but standing tall, had won. She had fought back, and in doing so, she had taken control. And Officer Davis, he was left standing there, unsure of what to do, realizing far too late that his power had crumbled in the face of her courage. The tension between Jasmine and Officer Davis hung thick in the air. He was still trying to find his footing, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. The crowd had grown, more phones pointed at him than he could count. He could feel their eyes on him, the weight of his actions pressing down harder with every passing second. Jasmine's defiance was not only a challenge to him, but to the whole system he represented. But just as Davis opened his mouth preparing to say something, anything, he was interrupted by a voice he knew all too well. A man stepped forward from the crowd, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Officer, you're done here." Davis looked up, startled, and his eyes locked onto the newcomer. Detective Parks, his partner in crime, literally and figuratively, had arrived. But this wasn't a usual day. Parks had always been a bit more subtle in his ways. But today, something felt different. "You need to step back," Davis said, his voice shaky as he motioned to Parks. "This is nothing. I've got this under control." But Parks wasn't backing down. "No, you don't," he shot back. "And neither do I." Jasmine stood there, dripping wet, her heart still pounding in her chest. She had thought the confrontation was over, but now there was more to it. Something about Parks' cold demeanor sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't here to calm things down, he was here for something else. The realization hit Jasmine like a bolt of lightning. Parks wasn't just here to back up Davis, he was complicit in this entire thing. He had been watching the whole time, just like Davis had been. He hadn't intervened. And now, seeing him standing there, Jasmine began to understand the full scope of the danger she was in. The truth was simple. This wasn't an isolated incident. The two officers had been working together, abusing their power, and Jasmine had unknowingly walked right into the middle of their corrupt game. They weren't just out of line, they had crossed a dangerous line. And it wasn't just about race anymore. It was about covering up a long-standing pattern of misconduct that had been allowed to fester. "You think you're going to get away with this." Jasmine's voice was steady, but every word packed a punch. She wasn't talking to just Davis now. Parks was just as guilty, and she wasn't about to let him off the hook. Parks seemed unfazed, but Davis shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Jasmine and his partner. "We don't need to escalate this," Davis said weakly. He had lost his confidence, and Jasmine could see it. He was no longer the imposing officer who had shoved her into the water. "Escalate," Jasmine repeated, narrowing her eyes. "You think you're in control, don't you? You're not, and neither is he." Jasmine's words stung. Parks, who had always walked with a smug sense of superiority, was now on the back foot. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, certainly not by someone who had just been attacked. But Jasmine wasn't just any woman. She was someone who had had enough of being bullied, pushed around, and treated as less than human. And then came the bombshell. A young man from the crowd stepped forward, holding up a smartphone. The same video that was already being shared online was now being broadcast live. What happened next shocked everyone, even Officer Davis. The video showed not just the moment Jasmine was shoved into the river, but it also captured Detective Parks laughing behind Davis, clearly enjoying the chaos as it unfolded. The video didn't just expose Davis's brutal push, it showed Parks' callous indifference. This was a coordinated effort, a setup, and now the entire world could see it. The crowd gasped. Jasmine stood still watching as Parks' cold smirk melted into a mask of shock. The truth was out. As the video went viral, pressure began to mount. Jasmine's fight wasn't just about self-defense anymore. It had become a mission to expose the corruption within the department. The video wasn't just evidence of police brutality. It was the nail in the coffin of a system that had let officers like Davis and Parks run unchecked. Detective Parks realized, too late, that Jasmine's fight had revealed something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The public was demanding accountability, and it was clear that he and Davis were on the verge of losing everything. Their actions had crossed a line, and now they were exposed. Jasmine had become a symbol. Her courage, her fight for justice, had shaken the very foundations of the system. And she wasn't done. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. The aftermath of the confrontation was a turning point, not just for Jasmine but for the entire community. The video had gone viral, and it spread like wildfire, sparking outrage, support, and, most importantly, change. What started as an ordinary walk by the river had turned into an event that would forever alter Jasmine's life, and the lives of countless others who had experienced similar acts of injustice. Officer Davis and Detective Parks were put under investigation, but the damage was done. The officers weren't just facing legal charges, they were facing the full force of public scrutiny. Jasmine had become a symbol of resistance, showing that even in the face of violence, there was power in standing up. The shocking exposure of their actions wasn't just a wake-up call for them, it was a wake-up call for everyone. But the fight didn't stop there. Jasmine, now a symbol of courage and resilience, wasn't going to let this moment fade into the past. She began to speak out, sharing her experience with the world. Every interview, every rally she attended was more than just a platform for her. It was a chance to remind the world that real change needed to happen. It was a chance to shine a light on the corruption and racism embedded in law enforcement. She was now using her voice to fight for the countless others who had been silenced by a system that protected its own, no matter the cost. As Jasmine's voice grew louder, so did the calls for reform. Protests erupted across the country, with people from all walks of life standing in solidarity with her. The pressure on the police department intensified, and lawmakers who had been silent for too long began to take action. Public demand for change had reached a boiling point. This was no longer just about one incident. It was about a system that needed to be overhauled. The investigation into Officer Davis and Detective Parks revealed more than just two bad apples. It uncovered a deeply entrenched pattern of abuse and misconduct. As Jasmine and others like her continued to speak up, more victims came forward, sharing their stories of mistreatment and violence. The police force was forced to acknowledge that this wasn't just an isolated problem. It was a systemic issue that needed real, lasting change. Jasmine's fight wasn't over. She was part of a larger movement, a movement to demand accountability and bring about real reform. She worked tirelessly with activists and legal teams to push for stronger laws and policies to protect communities of color from police brutality. She had turned her pain into power, and with every word she spoke, the movement grew stronger. Her strength had turned a moment of violence into a platform for justice. Jasmine knew the battle wasn't won yet, but she also knew that the fight had already made a difference. People were listening, and more importantly, they were starting to act. This wasn't just about punishing the officers involved. It was about changing the system that allowed them to act with impunity. Jasmine had become the spark for a fire that was already spreading. The lesson here was clear. One person's courage can change everything. Jasmine's decision to stand tall, to face the officer who had tried to break her, didn't just change her own life. It changed the narrative for so many others who had suffered in silence. The fight for justice, for equality, and for accountability was no longer just an abstract concept. It was a movement powered by the voices of people like Jasmine. And so, Jasmine's fight continued. She knew that true change wasn't going to happen overnight, but she also knew that, with each passing day, the walls of injustice were beginning to crumble. The journey was far from over, but Jasmine was more determined than ever to see it through. Her story, and the lessons from it, would not be forgotten. Jasmine's fight was never just about her. What started as an isolated incident in the park became a rallying cry for justice. Her courage in the face of violence, her refusal to back down when pushed into that river, sparked something much bigger. People from all walks of life rallied behind her, demanding accountability and change. The world could no longer ignore the systemic issues of police brutality that had plagued communities for far too long. But Jasmine's story is far from over. It's a movement, not just a moment. The reforms we need, the justice that so many have been denied, won't happen overnight. It's up to us to keep pushing for the changes that are long overdue. We can't just stand by. We must be a part of the solution. If Jasmine's story moved you, don't stay silent. Share this video, comment below, and tell others about what happened. Use your voice to keep this fight alive. Stand with Jasmine, stand with everyone who's ever been wronged, and let's continue the push for change. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that push for a better world. Together, we can make sure Jasmine's courage isn't just remembered. It's what sparks a global movement. Remember, justice doesn't stop with one person. It starts with all of us.